That's about over the light. Amen. It's good to be back in the Lord's house this morning. We are here. Thankful for those that are able to be with us. Amen. Of course, pots and pans are rattling, as the pastor likes to say. He's off rattling pots and pans. So let's pray for him this morning as he's doing homecoming. But the Lord will help us. And the Lord is good to us. We're continuing in Hebrews in chapter 11 for where we're at, but also we'll be reading in Genesis chapter 5. If you want to follow along for the reading, our next person in the book of faith, in the hall of faith, as you will, that we'll talk about last week was Abel, and talked about Abel and Cain and Abel's sacrifice being accepted as he sacrificed with a whole heart, with the realization that this is the way it was, and was willing to serve God on God's terms, not on his terms. We talked today about Enoch and talking about Enoch, but let's look at Genesis chapter 5. In Genesis chapter 5 and verse 21, this is the verses that we most know about Enoch. Genesis chapter 5 and 21, and Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters, and all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Of course, in verse 24 is the verse that we all know about Enoch, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. But there's a bit more to Enoch's story as we look at Enoch's story and find out who he was and a little bit about him. You can turn to the book of Jude. If you look at the book of Jude, and I'll let you guess what chapter that you can go at in the book of Jude. In the book of Jude, verse 14, and Jude is right before Revelations. It's going to be pretty small. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh when 10,000 of his saints, to execute a judgment upon all, and to convince all that were ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and all of their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These were murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lust, and their mouth speaking great swelling words, having men persons in admiration because of advantage. So a very different, or a second picture of Enoch in the book of Jude, that we learn a little bit more about Enoch. And then in Hebrews chapter 5, if you want to, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 5. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him, for before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God. And then there's a commentary after the life of Enoch that we can read, and we read that commentary. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is rewarded of them which diligently seek him. So the commentary on Enoch is faith. And we look, of course, in this chapter of faith being the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For it by the elders obtained a good report. Through faith we understood that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. And looking at faith and looking at Enoch living in this time, we learned again we started off with Abel, learning about Abel and talking about Abel last week. Now, Enoch lived in the antediluvian age, and the Bible records that these days when the earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence, so the time before the flood. Now, often we misconstrue, or at least I do, unless I really slow down and think about this time, that we forget this age. And I think this is an age that, as we do in all of our studies, and as we look at these and try to delve a little bit deeper into who these people are, and where these people lived and the time frame to really understand. We lose this historical perspective unless we slow down and think about it, because so many times we've heard these stories or read these verses, and as I always like to say, some of us first saw these stories in flannel graph in Sunday school, and you've heard these stories over and over, and we've learned this and we've read these chapters, but sometimes we slow down and we really think about where these are and the lessons that we can learn. And in this time frame of the time before the flood, the antediluvian time, this space of time between creation and the flood, and often we forget that this is a fairly long time frame here. There's about as much time frame between there and the flood that there is between Christ's death and our time frame now, this 2,000 plus year mark that we're at here, that when the flood happens. So that kind of helps us set this historical time frame. Everything that has happened on the earth in the last 2,000 years is about the time frame that you have between creation and the flood. So there's this substantial amount of time that a lot of things get to happen. Now, when we think about these, we also have to remember the age time frame of the length of days that these people had, and their long lives that they had, and it kind of helps us reset the historical perspective from where we're at in the time frame, in a time that the majority of people, it was not uncommon to have a 900-year lifespan, and we have to remember that in this time frame they had perfect genetics. And because everyone was fresh off creation, and there had not been the effects of sin, had not had the time to affect these lives, and so they had these perfect genetics and never really got sick, never really had any physical problems, never really had anything go wrong with them except accidental problems that had happened. They did not have the effects of sin upon their lives as of yet. To this aspect, on my physical standpoint, this begins to change after the flood. They had perfect weather. It did not rain. They had blue skies and sunny days, and the mist rose up from the ground and watered the earth. They never had to worry about whether it was going to rain or what was going to happen. They had a perfect geological placement. They were placed in the cradle of civilization, in the most fertile place in the world. Even after the flood, this was the most fertile place in the world. So yes, they did have to, by the toil of their brow, they had to plant crops, but it wasn't like they had to work the crops a whole lot. This was the perfect time frame. Everything grew perfectly. They lived in the perfect environment. Everything was perfect. And as they lived this life, the repercussions of the garden had begun to fall away. As we see this separation between the lives, this becomes an old wives' tale that they had heard for hundreds and hundreds of years, that this old wives' tale kind of seems to fade away. And then as we see that sin happens and Cain does, there's no recourse on Cain's life that you're able to see. Cain's still alive. He killed his brother, and God, of course, places a curse on whoever kills Cain. And so we have this time frame that we have these people that are growing further and further away from God. We have this whole lineage. The earth is exploding with these people who are less and less inclined toward God. Cain's people are growing. Cain's people are prosperous. Cain's people are just doing whatever they want to do. We can look, and in the middle of this age, and this spot inside of this is Enoch, who lived by faith to the point that his contemporaries knew him as a man who walked with God and was not, for God took him. There wasn't a question of Enoch's life. There wasn't a question of what happened in Enoch's life. When Enoch was gone, we all knew why Enoch was gone. He was this bright star of godliness, of one that's living in this age at this time. So when we read this first chapter in Genesis, when we read these first 5 verses in Genesis, it's this very monotonous reading of how we read these things when we read through the descendants and the book of generations of Adam. As we read through that, and this person was born, and they were so old when the child was born, and then they lived so many days or years after that, and then they died, and then that child lived so long and had their child, their first child, and then they lived so many long, and then they died, and then we get to the point here that we're into that seventh generation, and we get to this point, and Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah, and he walked with God, and he was not. So we're here at this point, this stark contrast of these two lives. You see, there's the other life that we can look at is Lamech. When we look in Genesis chapter 4, we see Adam's descendants through Cain. When we look one chapter back, we can see in Genesis chapter 4 and verses 19 through 24, we hear a little bit about Lamech. And Lamech took upon him two wives. The name of one was Adah, and the other was Zillah. And Adah bare Jabal, and he was the father that such as dwell in tents and of such have cattle. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all of such as handle the harp and organ. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, the instructor of every artifice in brass and iron. And the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a young man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be vengefully sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. So he has this little bit of a speech that he has, and it presents this dark revelation, this dark climax of how the Cainite genealogy had descended, and they had just gotten further and further and further away. And he boasts about killing, he boasts about murder. He's the first that has multiple wives. He writes this piece, and he's praising himself for being I'm just so wonderful. And we see this separation of the generations. And so Enoch's contemporary of 7 generations through Cain is Lamech, and 7 generations through Seth is Enoch. And there's this division in between the two. And if you don't feel that how you live your life matters to your descendants, you should be able to see it in this aspect. I went, had the opportunity and the somewhat, I guess, obligation as these things run, to go to a family reunion yesterday. And as I get older, I realize that everybody else is getting older too. So took the opportunity to go see the friends or the family that many of my mom. This was my mom's side. My mom is the youngest of 14 children, so many of her older brothers and sisters have passed away, and so we're left with just a remaining few of those that are on the lower end of the birth spectrum, as you'd say, as many of the aunts and uncles have passed away. And so I was over visiting and began to hear stories as we were just talking, sitting around with some of my cousins, and my mom and my aunts were sitting there talking about two of the, I guess, stories I'd never heard. It was my grandfather's dad. They talked about him and that he was not a nice man to his wife. Now, I never knew him. He passed before even my aunts and uncles, before my mom and them even grew up. And my grandmother, my great-grandmother, was just the nicest, sweetest person in the world. You'd have never realized kind of where she was. But originally, they were not in church. And then on my that was on my grandmother's side of the family. On my granddad's side of the family, they said that his mom after his dad passed away, she wasn't a pleasant person either. But we see in there, and so we begin to talk about how the difference is when one couple begin to decide to be different than everybody that they had grown up in, when they decide to change things, when they decide, and mom told about when my grandparents got married, that they made a pact with each other. They said, if you won't cut your hair anymore, I'll quit smoking. And so that's what it was through their whole life. They decided from there on out, if you'll do right, I'll do right. And grew up in church and grew up and went to church and changed the curve of the family, if you would say, changed who you were. And so I look around, and not all my aunts and uncles are in church, and there were a time that only mom and dad were the ones that remained in church, but as time marched on, many of them had returned to the faith and had begun to go to church and had gotten saved. And so these times change as we live a life that influences the generations behind us. We can see this influence happening. But overall, when we look at Enoch's life, Enoch lived in a place that was ungodly, that was in a place that this was before the flood. I mean, as much as Noah, who's 2 generations further down, such was Enoch. In the place that he lived, Enoch saw all this happens. But yet, in the middle of this, as I say often over and over when we talk about these stories, as we talk about these time frames, these years that are here when people are living 900 years and getting away with what they wanting to do. You can do a whole lot of house projects in 900 years. I mean, you can do a whole lot of things. You can get a whole lot done if you have 900 years to work on it in perfect weather, and you don't have to worry about it raining, and you don't have to worry about all these things. So there was these vast accomplishments that would begin to happen. And so again, as we get to that point, here's where we are, and the knowledge that they had and their ability to create. We remember that just after the flood was the Tower of Babel, and that came from the knowledge that the forefathers had that had been passed on throughout the flood. The knowledge of the ability to build, the knowledge and the ability to do things, the knowledge and the ability to just have a lot and be able to accomplish and feel like you've accomplished this in yourself. And we see that in the age of Enoch, of people saying that I've accomplished this and I do this. Such is the world that we live in. Very, as we often can sit and draw the parallels for where we're at, that Enoch was just another man living just another day. And we realize that there's nothing distinguishing about Enoch. He had no distinguishing marks from his ancestors or successors. He was described in the same terms as the other. There's no monastic life. He didn't have this unique revelation to begin his life. He didn't have an angel that come down and spoke with him and said, this is what you should do. He was neither immune nor protected from his everyday problems, his everyday difficulties that everybody else had. Just an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But something changes in his life. Now, the writer of the book here, of the study book, says the birth of his son Methuselah brings on this sudden change. Because when you read through this in Genesis chapter 5, we read about Methuselah being born, and then it begins to say he begins to walk with God. So something changes in the life of Enoch. Something changes at this time point. Something changes of where Enoch is and what he's doing. Is when we see this, when we get to this point, we see that Enoch changes something about who he was, and the life of Enoch changes as he begins to see things a little differently, as he begins to see things on a different time point and a different place, and he begins to see that Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah. So whether that after is saying that this was the time frame, or whether the birth of his child changed things, but either way, Enoch begins to realize that things have to be different. Enoch begins to realize that things must be different, that we cannot continue in the way that I am, that I cannot continue. What goes on around me cannot continue. What I see around me cannot continue. And we see the relationship of God, the relationship of Enoch changing, that he begins to maybe remember the stories. Now, maybe he remembers of what it was. Now, the interesting thing, again, as I often do, as I line these things up, as we forget, we have to remember, as I said, we have to remember things on the lifespan time point, because Adam is still alive, and Adam will be alive for the vast majority of Enoch's life. So quite possibly, Enoch goes and he knocks on his great granddad's door, and hears the story straight from Adam of walking in the Garden of Eden. You see, it's very likely that happened. He had, several hundred years to do it. You get around to a whole lot of things in several hundred years. Check off a lot of things on the to-do list. And so he goes and he talks to Adam, perhaps, and hears of walking with God in the garden. Not just the relationship of knowing God, not just a relationship of being with God, but walking with God. Not just walking before God, not just walking after God, but walking with God. You see, the difference on that is when we walk before God, it implies an evaluation, requires godly fear, a continual awareness that God is evaluating everything you do, everything you think, everything you say. Walking after God implies a direction and requires godly initiative, a continued effort to follow God's will and way. And walking with God implies togetherness and requires that godly covenant, a continual agreement with all that God says and does. So there's this difference of walking, and in our life, our striving is yes, I realize that I go and God watches every step that I do. I realize that everything I do, that God is there, that God is watching what I do, and seeing everything that I do. But as an Amos says, can two walk together except they be agreed? But when I walk with God, it's more than just going before and saying, I'm going to do the right thing because God's going to watch me. I'm going to do the right thing because I don't want to get in trouble. That's the life of the 16 to 18-year-old kid. I'm going to do what's right because I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to get on restriction. I know Dad and Mom's watching. I'm going to do this. But then there comes that time frame of walking with God. When I agree with the decision and I'm walking with God, He doesn't have to point the way and say, here, go there, here, go there, here, go there. That's the life of the 6 to 8-year-old, of the 12-year-old, when Dad's just saying, do this, do this, do this, and you follow the commands. And so, okay, I'm doing the right thing because I'm being pointed and I'm being led. But when there comes the point in time that I agree with God wholeheartedly, not only did I grow up in the church, not only did I grow up here, not only do I know that this is the right way to live, but I agree that this is the right way to live. I agree that this is the way that I want to walk. I agree that this is the life that I want to live. I'm not just doing it because I want to go to heaven, and if you'll let me say it that way, I'm not just doing it because because I know it's the right thing to do, but I'm doing it because I agree with the walk. And Enoch begins to have that relationship with God in his life, that he's walking with God. Not just, I know this is the right thing and I know that this is what we should be doing, but he begins to have that relationship of this continuous day-to-day walking with one foot after the other, agreeing with God, doing God's will, listening to God's call, listening to God's talk, not only knowing that God's right here beside me and watching what I'm doing, but I'm having a conversation about this is the way to go about it. I've never walked this road before. I've never made these steps before, but I'm walking with one that knows the way that we're going, and he knows what's right and wrong, but I'm having a discussion with him that I'm getting to this place that I'm walking along, and so I'm just going along, that we have this expressed agreement, and it applies this progress that we're going along and we're getting things done. Not only am I just blindly following, I'm not just blindly following, or I'm just going and just trying to do the best I can. And those things sometimes apply in life. It feels like that's where you are, and so you keep going and you stay faithful and you do as you do. But when we get to that point that we realize that we're walking hand in hand with the Savior, that we're not walking before God or after God, but we can walk with God and have that daily relationship and that daily walk with Him. And as much as I begin to think about that, and I guess thinking about it from the context of walking with a parent, there are times that you feel like that I know God hadn't left me, but He's just kind of let me walk by faith, and so I'm just making the steps that I know that's the right thing to do. And sometimes that happens in life, and I'm sure Enoch had those days where he said, I know I'm doing the right thing, I'm just going to continue to do the right thing. But yet we can have that relationship that I know that God's not only watching me and caring for me and blazing the trail before me, but He's walking right beside me. And I can have a discussion with Him on what my decisions are and what I want to do. So a loving, humble, trusting heart is this key, unbroken, perpetual fellowship with God. And that should be our goal. When we walk, when we go, when we do, our goal should be to walk after God every step of the way and realizing where we're at. So Enoch walked with God and was not. But we'll learn a little bit more about Enoch when we look at Jude. We learn that Enoch was the first prophet, and Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these things, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of His saints to execute judgment upon all. Enoch understood that what was going on couldn't last. Enoch looks out his front door and looks at his neighbors and realizes that their life is perpetually in wickedness. And Eli realizes this can't continue on, that God hates sin, he goes and has a discussion with Adam and realizes that, man, if God wouldn't let Adam do this one thing, how is all the rest of this being allowed to take place? And he hears about the promises that Adam heard from God of there'll be one that arises and it shall crush the head, would bruise the heel, and all these things. And Enoch begins to realize that this cannot continue, that judgment is coming, and God reveals to him, behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all. Enoch sets the stage here for Noah, that there will be a payday, that there is a payday that's coming someday. That in the midst of you think that you're getting away with it, in the midst that you think that you're living your life, and Lamech, you may feel like that you're getting away with this, and if Cain got away with it, I'll get away with it more times than Cain did, and I'll be worse than Cain, and I'll do more than Cain, and I'll still get away with it, and I'll still walk away. And so Enoch, God reveals to Enoch the coming of the Lord with his holy ones to execute judgment upon us all. And Enoch, as God's voice in those evil and violent days before the flood, denounced the ungodly for their ungodly deeds and their hard words against God, and warned them of impending judgment. Enoch, the first prophet, the first one that said, this isn't right. This cannot continue. You cannot continue to do these things. There will be a payday one day. And Enoch, in his walk with God, and Enoch as he walks. And so in Hebrews chapter 11 and 5, by faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him. So the record of Enoch's forefathers, as we read through Genesis chapter 5, they lived and they died. The righteous lived and they died. The wicked lived and they died. Such were the first generations of Adam. But the record of Enoch shows a noticeable change. He walked with God and was not, for God had translated him. He lived for 365 years, with the last 300 in a continual, unbroken relationship with God. And then all of a sudden, he was not found by friend or foe, for he was no longer on earth. He was taken alive to heaven by God. His removal in the middle of the antediluvian age, so that all the patriarchs mentioned in the genealogy were alive, except for Adam. This is quite possibly, there had only been a handful of natural deaths. As I begin to think about this, as Enoch walked with God and was not, there had only been a handful of natural deaths to this point. Only Adam had lived long enough possibly to die. When we look at the rest of the time frame that's after that, there had only been just a handful. Adam had lived to be over 930 years old. Seth lives to be 1,042 years old. He lives to be to the year, the calendar year. So he lives to be almost 900 years old. Enos lives to be almost 900 years old. Canaan lives to be almost 900 years old. And so all of them are still alive except for Adam. Adam, at 930 years old, dies, and he had only been dead about 70 years. Or about 60 to 70 years Adam had been dead. And then Enoch walks with God and with not. So the disappearance of Enoch was an unnatural thing. Death was still an unnatural thing. We do know there had been some murders in the time frame before them, but of a natural death, of a natural being gone, everybody was still alive for the most part. But yet Enoch walks with God as with not. Certainly his removal from their midst, no doubt, was a conversation piece for both the righteous and the wicked. His reward for faith, this miraculous removal to heaven, from earth without dying, proclaimed to the whole world the reward for trusting God as a restoration of immortality. His faith in God was the seed that produced the fruit of a holy life, and with faith was ripened by continual communication with God. He was taken by God to glory for his good pleasure. Very few times, there's a couple. His translation, along with Elijah's, foreshadows the rapture of the church, of course, when we're one day, those that are alive and remain. If it's us, we'll be caught up to be with heaven, to be the Lord in heaven. Those that have passed will meet him in the air, and so will we always forever be with the Lord. So our understanding is this is our blessed hope and our comfort message of who it is. But we realize that Enoch had that daily walk, that daily faith, that daily walk with God, and those steps that he took. And that was the point of Enoch's life. That's the point of Enoch's life, that he lived in a day much like we do. Certainly, times they are a changing. We realize that we live in a world that's, as much as it's been fraught, such as it evermore has been this weekend. If you keep much up with the news, you just kind of go, I wonder what's happening. And then you realize that we're in that time frame that the Bible talks about there being wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes in divers places. But yet we realize that we're not the first ones, as I say, that have ever lived in this time frame. And part of when we look at Enoch's life, or we look at the lives of the saints that we look at, and part of the reason for looking at their lives is they didn't live often in a perfect world. Sometimes we forget about that they were daily men and daily women doing daily things and living their daily life and walking a life and doing their best. Did they have daily struggles? Sure they did, because we have daily struggles. Did they have daily concerns? Sure they did, because we have daily concerns. They were normal people. Their concerns may have been a little different than ours. Their concerns may have been a little more dated than ours, but yet they still had concerns. They still saw the world that was going on around them and lived in a time that several of these that we study about lived in a time when there wasn't a whole lot of people that followed God. In Enoch's life, there wasn't a whole lot of people that followed God. We can look to see, and we can pick out a few of his ancestors that theoretically followed God, but for the vast majority of Enoch's life and for those around him, he was surrounded by those that were evil, to the point that the world was destroyed by flood because it was just so evil, to the point that the world was corrected course with the flood because it was so evil. And so it's kind of hard sometimes for us to really conceptually realize where they were at, to conceptually realize where Enoch was standing as we look at that at life, and as we look at kind of where Enoch was at. And it's hard for us to say. And so I try to help catch a glimpse of that when I talk about the time frames, and we talk about the lifespans, and we talk about all of that, just realizing where Enoch stood on his daily life, just doing the best that he can. But yet he realized in the middle of all that all that I look around you, when I see all of this, when I see all this chaos and turmoil and people seeming to get away with what they could get away with, and just doing what was right in their own eyes, I mean, who's going to stop me? Who's going to keep me from doing this? Was there a justice system in place? I don't know. Probably not. Was there a system of laws in place were this in place? No, probably not. It was probably a world of, if you're strong enough to get away with it, you're strong enough to get away with it. As the weak are suppressed by the strong, and the strong do what they want to do. And if you're strong enough to do whatever you want to do, then continue to do what you want to do. There's nobody big enough to stop you. I have my own army. Is your army bigger than mine? No, your army is not bigger than mine. Then I'll just do what I want to do. And so Enoch lives in this world that he sees all this, but Enoch hears from the voice of the Lord because of his understanding that this cannot continue. This just cannot stick and stay. So when we live in a world that we're living this life, and there's no Enoch lived in a world without a Pentecost. He lived in a world without saints around him. He lived in a world without without salvation. He lived in all of this, but yet he looked around him and said, I can walk with God in the middle of this. That God's again, maybe he sits down and talks to Adam for a long period of time and hears about how Adam walked with God, and Enoch says, I want to do that. I think that I can serve God. I think that I can find a way, and I realize that what I see around me is not the right way. I realize when I look around me, that's not the way that I want to go, but I think I can find a way. I think that I can follow that path. I think that I can do that. I think that I can be in that place and serve God and walk therein and live that life. I think that I can walk in that. And so we see Enoch beginning to change, whether it was the birth of Methuselah that changed that changed what he was doing, I don't know. But yet we find that he says, and as we see over and over in all of this, as we see through that God says that we can walk in this path, that and Jeremiah says, stand ye in the ways and see and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, for ye shall find rest for your souls. But the sad part about Jeremiah is there's those that say we will not walk therein. Jeremiah says we can walk in this way, just as the same way that Enoch walked with God and was not. But the more important thing about that scripture is we often focus on the he was not, which is an amazing thing that God just ever how he decides to whether he just starts walking and steps off the cliff and just keeps walking into heaven, or where he just was something came down like in Elijah's day, the chariot of fire and angels. Did those around him see it? Did the neighbors see Enoch go for a walk and just poof and he's gone like a trick? Or did something come down and get him? I don't know. Either way, they knew that it had happened. Enoch was gone. That boy was gone, and we know why. He wasn't like the rest of us. He was a different cat. He lived life a little different. He walked with God. That was the guy that I know why God took him, because he wasn't like the rest of us. And that witness, and he always talked about that the Lord was coming, and with 10,000 saints, and there's executing judgment. Well, I wonder if judgment's going to come. I don't know. And so life goes on, but that reverberating refrain in the ears of those that had listened, that you can't live this way and get by, that payday will come one day. He walked with God and was not, and was the prophet that said, you can't get by. And so generations later, if we go back and look, Enoch is gone, and then Methuselah comes, and just a few days after Enoch, on a grand scheme of things, just a few days after Enoch is gone, there's this young boy called Noah that's born about 70 years later. Now again, most of the people that heard Enoch's story is still alive. Most of the ones that heard Enoch's prophecy are still alive, even though it was 70 years later. All of those, Enoch's father, Jared, lives close to 500 years after Enoch was not. Methuselah, Enoch's son, he lives he's going to live close to 800 years after Enoch. He lives about 800 years of Enoch's life, and so about 500 years after Enoch's disappearance, Methuselah stays around to tell the story of his dad, Enoch, and the prophecies of my dad. And I remember my dad's prophecies, and I remember this, and so he tells that story. Lamech is born as the next one down that we can look at, and he heard the prophecies of Enoch because he lived 100 or so years when Enoch was alive, and so he heard the prophecies of Enoch. And so Methuselah can repeat the prophecies of Enoch. Lamech can repeat the prophecies of Enoch to their son and grandson Noah. And so as Enoch sets the plate for Noah, as Enoch sets this and says, there will be a judgment that comes. He's gone and he's disappeared, but God obviously honors his testimony. God obviously honors his life. God honestly honors his truly walking with the Lord. This eminently holy man in the middle of this chaos, in the middle of everybody doing what's right. You have a man that lives so close to God that he walks with God and is not, and that God takes him from there. Certainly we can look and say that he pleased God with his walk. Certainly we can look to see that he walks with God. He's the first on record to search the Lord with all of his heart, and he's rewarded as God as his ever-present companion. He's an ordinary man with the daily cares of family life, but yet in this he lived under the most unfavorable of circumstances, but yet in this he begins to walk with God, and he says, I can do different from all of those that are around me. His knowledge of God, very elementary. The only one that he had to talk to was Adam. He could go get a little information of Adam, of what Adam had walked, and Adam could rehearse what the angel had told him, and that's all that they knew. There was no Bible. There was no scripture. They were were living Genesis. They weren't even writing it. They hadn't even got that far yet. They were walking the steps. They're in this time frame when there's nothing else to know, but Adam's able to say, there was a time when this is the way that it was. And Enoch hears these stories, and Enoch has this very rudimentary knowledge that God loves us, and God cares for us, and there is a hope, and there is something that's going to happen, and there is this. But when I look around at this world, I realize that this isn't the way God made it to be. This isn't the relationship that we're to have. This isn't what's supposed to happen. This isn't the walk that we're supposed to have. This isn't what I'm supposed to see. And surely we can see that in our life around us. This isn't what's right. I know that this ain't right. I know that this ain't right. I know that this ain't right. But in the middle of all that, I do know what is right. There's a whole lot of things that I know that ain't right, but I also know what is right. And if I spend the time looking at that, then I realize that there's a hope that I have. As much as Enoch had a hope, as much as Enoch had that knowledge of God and said, I can live on that. And here I am, and his time on the earth was filled with corruption and vileness and godliness. And in the midst of it all, he's this bright, shining light of virtue and holiness that still shines as an example to us and for those around him. And how much more we look just 3 generations later of his great-grandson Noah, Enoch's great-grandson Noah, walked with God and pleased the Lord. And that continuation of how he lived his life passes on to his great-grandson, that God says, all right, I found one man. And such as it is as we live in our life, that we walk in a time frame that you see the world around us, it's the world that we live in. You'd like to say it's not as bad as the days of Noah, not as bad as some of the other things that happened, but it's also not a world that we're really happy with what we see going on, of some of the social changes that we see happening, of some of the things that begin to be accepted, and how godliness seems to be smiled upon, and or godlessness seems to be smiled upon, and godliness is frowned upon. You can't live that way. You don't have to live that way. Why are you so judgmental? Why are you like that? That's not what it is. But then I realized that it was that way before, but yet Noah walked in it, yet Enoch walked in it, and so can I. I can be a shining light. I can be one that stands on a hillside and said, this isn't right. There's going to be a payday for it. I'll do it in love. I'll do it with a heart of compassion, saying, you may not realize this, but God wants it to be different. God liked for it to be different. It needs to be different, but there is a judgment that is coming. You may not believe it. You may not think that it is. You may not suspect that it's going to be. You might feel that you can get away with what you're doing, but there is a judgment that is coming. There is a day. There is a payday. Just as the old song is, that there will be a payday someday. We may not seem like we get to it. It may seem like the wicked prosper. It may seem like the wicked get away with what they want to do. It may seem like the wicked just live their life and there is no recourse. There's no negative that happens, that Enoch looks around and he says, look, they just live in the way that they want to. They just do all these things that's not right. This isn't how we're supposed to live. And they live this life and they seem to get away with it. But there'll be a payday one day that all this will end, of all this will happen. And my goal is to not as much focus on them and focus on that and focus on all the stuff that around me. But my focus is on making heaven. I'll live as much as I can in the word of the Lord and walk behind him and walk before him and walk with him. That he'll keep by his side. Then I can realize that that's my goal. I'll live a life that hopefully those around me look around and say, I want to live that life. I live a life, and sometimes just living a life that people are uncomfortable around you because they feel judged in themselves. Not that you're being judgy, not that you're pushing judgment upon them, but they feel judged and convicted, such as it is. But I'll live a life that I want to walk with the Lord. And one day, I'll not be here either by death or by the rapture. I'll be gone. Good to be here this morning.